Hi everyone, it's Katrina. Number 10. Ancient Irish Island for sale. There is an uninhabited island off the west coast of Ireland that recently went up for sale. The island is home to a set of mysterious ancient ruins and is located in historic County Galway, close enough to see the dramatic Irish coastline. According to the Irish Times, the island was listed for $1.4 million, which is a surprisingly low price for your own personal island, right? Its name is Ardolian, and it's basically 80 acres of empty land. There are 2 small lakes on the island, and it's surrounded by rocky cliffs, and there isn't a single human within 2 miles. There are a few dilapidated modern buildings, but they are currently uninhabited. The history of Ardolian goes back at least 2,300 years. Although nobody lives there today, that wasn't always the case. People in the early Iron Age paddled boats out to the island and settled it in 300 BC. However, pollen samples taken around the island suggest that the earliest occupation may have been even earlier, around 1000 BC, although there are no physical remains of any buildings from 3,000 years ago. If you are curious who would occupy such a small and seemingly unimportant rock in the ocean, it was the Celtic people. Early medieval Christian monks flocked to the remote Irish islands in droves. Skellig Michael may be the most famous of all the monk islands because it was featured in Star Wars, but pretty much any piece of land that's not connected to a continent was once populated by medieval monks. The monks of Ardolian likely appeared on the island in the 7th century AD. It's believed the monastery was founded by Saint Fechin of Four, who later died when the monks came down with a contagious sickness. An epidemic swept across the island and many of the monks perished. Still, monks continued to arrive on the island, living a life of peace and quiet. The small hermitage eventually turned into a huge monastery, and they even had their own watermill at the edge of one of the lakes. But as was the case with so many isolated monasteries, the Vikings ruined their fun. It's believed the monastery was abruptly abandoned when a Viking raiding party showed up and did horrible things to them. This would have likely been in the 8th century AD or possibly the 9th. Luckily, the new owners of the island, whoever they may be, won't have to worry about Vikings destroying their stuff. They'll only have to worry about the brutal Atlantic storms that hit their island. Living here is like constantly being on the edge of a hurricane. Any takers? Let me know if you're interested. And now for number 9. But first, it's shout-out time. I want to give a big thank you to Angela Hernandez and DJ Always for supporting this channel. Thanks, guys! Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos like these. Number 9. Ramri Island Crocodile Massacre. Ramri Island in Myanmar is most famous today for the Crocodile Massacre that took place in World War II. This terrible and disturbing piece of history takes us back to early 1945. The Americans were busy fighting on 2 fronts: the war with Nazi Germany in Europe and the Pacific War with Japan. The American forces and their allies had just pinned down a group of 1,000 Japanese soldiers in a mangrove swamp on the coastline of what was then Burma, now Myanmar. Even though the Americans had pinned down their enemy, they didn't need to pursue them any deeper into the swamp. In the end, only 20 Japanese fighters made it back from Ramri Island. The other 980 were eaten alive by throngs of hungry crocodiles. The Guinness Book of World Records awarded the horrific event the distinction of most human fatalities in a crocodile attack. However, in recent years, historians have begun to doubt the savage tale. World War II experts are starting to wonder if there even were any crocodiles. We know that Japanese soldiers died during the battle for Ramri Island, a lot of them, but there isn't any real proof that they were killed by monstrous crocodiles. Nobody can decide, all these years later, what happened during the battle. There were eyewitness testimonies who claimed the sound of rifle fire could be heard all through the night, joined by the screams of wounded men being crushed by crocodile teeth. And in the morning, it was said vultures descended in such a thick swarm they nearly blocked out the sun. Whatever the crocodiles didn't eat, the vultures picked up. But some say it never happened at all. and that the inspiration came from a book published in 1962 by Royal Canadian Lieutenant Commander Bruce S. Wright. After the war, Wright became a biologist and author who included a brief story about a crocodile massacre in one of his books. 2 years later, the story was picked up by another scientist named Roger Karras, who called it the most deliberate attack ever made by a large animal on record. We don't know if Wright made the story up and if Karras then dramatized it, but as far as a lot of historians are concerned, Ramree Island was still the location of the worst mass crocodile attack in history. Number 8. Rabbit Island. Rabbit Island, or Okunoshima as it's called in Japan, is a national park that measures just a couple miles in circumference. It's small but is home to hundreds of rabbits, so it's visited by flocks of tourists every year. It's not exactly forbidden, although its history is grim, and these days it's mostly just used as a rabbit breeding ground. The entire island is swarming with rabbits. It's also still dotted with the overgrown remains of biological weapons facilities from World War II. Between 1929 and 1945, Rabbit Island was the site of massive poison gas production plants. It was such a sensitive site that it was literally erased from the map, and all mention of it was purged from the records. It was home to one of Japan's most important chemical weapons research labs. And although the chemical weapons designed and tested here are no longer a threat to anyone, the ruins of the awful buildings have never been torn down. It looks kind of like an island version of Chernobyl, with the huge concrete structure slowly being eaten by moss and covered in rabbit excrement. One of the ruins is a power plant, complete with its 8 destroyed generators. The plant supplied electricity to the chemical production facilities. Then, during the Korean War, it was used as an ammo depot for the US military. The ugliest structure on the island by far, though, is the poison gas storehouse in Nagaura. It's the biggest poison gas storage facility on the island, once containing over 100 tons of poison gas. Seeing as gas doesn't weigh very much, that's an incredible amount. The massive tanks are still sitting on their concrete foundations today. You can even see the char marks from where they tried to destroy the storehouse with flamethrowers after the war. However, Rabbit Island is a much different place today. There is now a poison gas museum on the island to help educate the new generation about the horrors of World War II, specifically the victims of toxic experiments conducted to test chemical weapons. But to be honest, most people don't even come here to see the ruins. They come specifically for the rabbits. In Japanese culture, rabbits are a good omen. People make the journey here simply to visit the rabbits and be blessed with good fortune. Number 7. Monserrat Island. The island of Monserrat in the Caribbean has been a hellish nightmare since 1995. The island is a self-governing territory of Britain, but it doesn't matter much who governs it because most of the island is covered in volcanic ash and lava. The main town was rendered almost entirely uninhabitable by explosive volcanic eruptions. Sporadic ash rain and lava flows were heavy from 1995 to 1997. For the first time in centuries, the Soufriere Hills volcano started erupting. Keep in mind that most islands in the Caribbean, and most islands anywhere in the world, were formed by volcanic activity. These islands only exist because of volcanoes, and at some point they'll likely be destroyed by them. In 1997, the biggest eruption yet killed 19 people. The entire southern part of Montserrat was devastated, and the capital of Plymouth was left buried beneath nearly 40 feet in hot volcanic ash. This understandably caused over half the population to flee in terror. The island's economy was utterly obliterated as a result. Tourists had no more interest in visiting Montserrat because they didn't want to be cooked alive. You can't really blame people for staying away from danger, even if things do appear to have cooled down. The southern part of Montserrat, the part that's near the volcano, is still entirely forbidden. You aren't allowed to go anywhere near the volcano just in case it leaks lava and you get turned into a roasted chicken. A new airport was inaugurated in 2005, and in 2002, construction started on a new town at the northern end of the island. The decision to build on the island is considered by some to be complete insanity, seeing as the Soufriere Hills volcano has a very good chance of erupting again. It's like building a town over the ruins of Pompeii and not expecting it to be destroyed. Would you be brave enough to live there? Let me know in the comments. Number 6. Volskaya Island. This island is an abandoned island where Soviet scientists tested super pathogens during the Cold War. This was a top-secret testing ground where the Soviets played around with biological warfare. And even though it's been abandoned for the last 20 years, it's hard to forget just how close the Soviets came to using deadly germs on innocent people. A very long time ago, the Aral Sea was the 4th largest sea in the world. It was a rich ecosystem with fish, animals, and a history going back thousands of years. But these days, it's a complete wasteland. The Aral Sea is almost 100% dry, and the fish are all dead, thanks to the Soviet Union. The Soviets diverted water from the sea to irrigate cotton fields, draining the entire thing and leaving a barren bowl enriched with carcinogenic pesticides. Volskaya isn't even really an island anymore because it's surrounded by miles of poisoned desert. There is still some water hugging the shores of the island, but it really isn't much. Back when the Aral Sea still had water in it, Volskaya was home to a fishing village, but now it's only home to the shells of military buildings from the 1970s. We don't know exactly what the Soviets were doing here, only that it wasn't good. The island has been implicated in all kinds of bizarre incidents. One of the strangest was in 1971, when the research vessel Lev Berg drove straight into a brown fog. Several days later, a young scientist was diagnosed with smallpox, even though she'd already been vaccinated against it. She would go on to recover, but 9 other people were infected and died, all from a smog cloud allegedly released by scientists at Volskaya. And that's only one example out of many. In 1988, 50,000 antelopes on a nearby steppe dropped dead in under an hour. The island was finally abandoned in the 1990s, but we still don't know what kind of horrible experiments they conducted or what kind of weapons they developed during their time there. Do you think biological weapons from the Soviet Union still pose a threat? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and be sure to subscribe while you're at it. Number 5. Bouveau Island. Bouveau Island has been called the most remote island in the entire world. It was discovered on January 1st, 1739 by the French. It's so isolated that the only way to reach the island is by traveling 1,600 miles from the nearest piece of land. Also, it's almost completely covered by a glacier. Only about 7% of the island is solid ground, with the rest blanketed in ice. At the center of the island is an inactive volcano that also happens to be filled with ice. It's like an inverted snow cone just waiting to explode. When French commander Jean-Baptiste Charles Bouvet de Lozier first discovered the island, he didn't record its location properly. Its coordinates were written down incorrectly, and Bouvet Island was lost for almost 70 years. It wasn't found again until a British whaler named James Lindsay came across it in 1808. After much debate over who the island belonged to, Norway finally took it for themselves in 1930. They still own it to this day, although the island doesn't exactly get much attention since it's so difficult to reach. The island is home to one intriguing mystery, though. In April 1964, a lifeboat was found moored on the shore of Bouvet Island. Someone had clearly rowed the lifeboat to the island and then abandoned it. But even after a meticulous search, no other trace of human life was found. We still don't know how that lifeboat got there or who in the world was on it. Number 4. Koh Tao. Koh Tao is a deadly paradise in the Gulf of Thailand, but for many years it was one of the must-visit destinations in the country. Foreigners traveled from all over the globe just to party on Koh Tao. But in recent years, the tropical paradise has taken on a different kind of fame. It's now being called Death Island, and tourists have been warned to stay far away. It's not clear when the deaths started, but things began to get very scary in 2014. Hannah Witheridge and David Miller, a couple of backpackers in their early 20s, were staying near the beautiful Sairi beach when they were butchered by a pair of men from Myanmar. On September 15, 2014, they were massacred seemingly for no reason. Their killers were tried and sentenced to death, but there was still more murder to come. On January 1, 2015, Dimitri Povse from France was found hanging from his balcony ceiling with his hands tied behind his back. Nobody knows what in the world is going on here, but Koh Tao has turned into a place where murder is all too common. In January 2018, a British tourist was discovered dead in a hotel pool. Many of these strange deaths have been ruled as accidents, with nobody really knowing what happened. The police said the British traveler died as a result of a tragic accident, but another body was found in a similar circumstance shortly after. And in June 2021, 2 more bodies were found dead in the Jamakiri Resort and Spa hotel pool. There are still thousands of tourists visiting Koh Tao every year without any kind of incident. But just because the majority are safe doesn't mean there isn't a murderer lurking just around the corner. Number 3. Dead Man's Island. Dead Man's Island is very small and is located off the coast of Kent in the United Kingdom. The island is only 3,900 feet long and 660 feet wide. It's separated from the mainland by a narrow channel called Shepherd's Creek, with the nearest town being Queensborough about half a mile away. Stepping foot on this island is absolutely prohibited. It's owned by Natural England and is considered a site of special scientific interest. The island is uninhabited and off-limits, but it's not entirely clear why. We know it's an important island for nesting birds, but there is something far more nefarious going on. In 2016, over 200 human remains were found on Dead Man's Island. It hasn't been completely verified, but the experts believe the island was once used as a burial ground for convicts. This was over 200 years ago, when criminals were kept prisoner in floating jails. They were most commonly called prison hulks, boats that weren't seaworthy anymore and were modified to be detention centers. Prisoners of war, civilians who were a threat to the government, and convicts of every variety were put inside prison hulks, then left to their misery just off the coast of England. It was a widespread practice throughout the 18th and 19th centuries in Britain. The issue was that their jails were hugely overcrowded. There was also a sudden rush of enemy prisoners from the Napoleonic Wars and other smaller wars during those centuries. The British needed somewhere to place all these prisoners, and so they put them on dirty old ships. Prison hulks were almost always vessels that were incapable of full service. That meant they were damaged and likely weren't safe on the water. It's also possible that they were full of disease. Some ships used were the HMS Warrior in 1840 and the HMS Discovery in 1818. Prison hulks were also used throughout British-owned territories, especially in the Caribbean. If you thought being in prison in the 1700s was terrible already, imagine being locked in a floating box with hundreds of other famished, sick, and injured prisoners. It would have been absolutely terrible, to say the least. The bones that were found on Dead Man's Island likely came from prisoners who were buried in the loose soil. Coastal erosion washed away a huge piece of the island, leading to who knows how many wooden coffins and human skulls being swept into the sea. But scientists did find over 200 human remains, not to mention all the wooden grave markers across the island. It's believed there are so many corpses here that no citizens are allowed to step foot on it. Number 2. Zhang Nanhai Island. Zhang Nanhai Island is an isolated compound located just outside the Forbidden City in Beijing. The island compound serves as the residence for the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP. This is the center for the Chinese government, so you can imagine it's not exactly somewhere they let tourists in to take photographs. But what's really interesting about the island is that it's been used for centuries. The island has been important to the Chinese government since the 15th century AD. The original complex was built during the Ming Dynasty in 1421. It was created in the middle of a small lake, just outside the walls of the Forbidden City. Then, during the Qing dynasty, which started in 1636, the island of Zhang Nanhai was used as the center of government. Empress Dowager Cixi, who ruled from 1861 to 1908, built her residence here instead of the Forbidden City. So did Prince Regent Chun, the very last emperor in Chinese history. These days, the island is the power hub of China. It started when Mao Zedong moved into the complex in 1949 after he established the People's Republic of China. The island is likely the most important government center that most people have never even heard of. Number 1. The Kurgulin Islands. Captain Yves-Joseph de Kurgulin of France discovered the Kurgulin Islands on February 12, 1772. These are some of the most remote islands in the world, the biggest of which is called Grande Terre, but is nicknamed the Isle of Desolation. The islands are currently listed as a national nature reserve, located far from human civilization in Antarctica. The islands are home to one of the highest concentrations of birds and marine mammals on the planet. There isn't a single permanent human dwelling here. There are some scientific bases, but nothing residential. You can't just pick up and move to one of the Kurgulin Islands to live with the penguins because it's strictly prohibited. The islands may be mostly forbidden today, but France once had big plans for them. When Captain Kurgulin returned to France from his voyage, he claimed that he had found the central landmass of Antarctica. But he didn't realize the island's main landmass was only an island. He believed French settlers could be transported to the Kurgulin Islands, where they would start colonies, grow food, and build a newer, fresher version of France. He simply needed groups of refugees who would be willing to transform the empty islands into a sort of paradise. But it was all wishful thinking. Captain James Cook came across the islands 4 years later and found out Captain Kurgulin was wrong. French refugees never did try to transform the islands, but it was a fun idea while it lasted. Would you ever consider living alone on an isolated island in the middle of the ocean? Let me know in the comments. And be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. See you next time. Bye!